My podcast guest today, returning champion Helen Pluckrose, is a liberal political and cultural writer and was one of the founders of Counterweight, a participant in the Grievance Study Affair probe. Recall that was with Pete Boghossian and James Lindsay, in which they highlighted problems in critical social justice scholarship by writing these faux papers and submitting them to peer-reviewed journals where they were accepted. She's the co-author of the book Cynical Theories, which she was on this show for before, and Social Injustice. Here's the new book. It's called The Counterweight Handbook: Principled Strategies for Surviving and Defeating Critical Social Justice at Work, in Schools, and Beyond. I love that cover, Helen. That's pretty cool. What a great idea.
And the counterweight colors.
Yeah. No, the colors are great, and the little teeter totter there with the stones. That's great. So you're in England now,
I am. Yes, I'm here in
and
East London.
yes, yeah. What do you do? Weren't you publishing A&M magazine, or have you pronounced
Aereo
it?
was my
Aereo. That's
magazine.
right.
When I took on a counterweight, I handed it over to Iona, and it has now been taken up by Quillette. So I'm just focusing
Oh,
fully on consulting with employers mostly about how to get critical social justice out of workplaces.
so that's what there's an organization called Counterweight upon which this book is written.
Yes. Yes, we formed Counterweight at the height of the protest in 2020, when so many businesses started making big statements and pledges and implementing policies and training programs that were making people affirm things they didn't believe. And I got hundreds of emails a day. Some of my colleagues got more. So we started pouring everybody into a Discord server, and then trying to triage their problems and help them sort of push back in a knowledgeable and principled way. So
Yeah, okay, before we get into the details of that, give us a big picture overview. What's the problem that you've set out to solve? What's the larger problem here? And go back in time as far as you want on that.
the critical social justice problem is it's a particular tautology here, but it's a particular approach to social justice that draws on critical methodologies which come through the postmodern and neo-Marxist tradition. And critical in that sense needs to be distinguished clearly from critical thinking, which is about epistemic adequacy and reasoned argument. Critical in the critical tradition, critical theory sense, is about looking for the hidden power structures that underlie everything and trying to subvert them. So this is where we get critical consciousness from, when you've become more aware of these power structures like white supremacy, patriarchy, imperialism, cisnormativity, and capitalism running through everything, and you become critically conscious of them, or in the common parlance now, woke. And the problem, as it has been happening, of course, first in universities, now in employment, is that this one methodology is being conflated with social justice as a whole. At any just being a good person, just caring about racism, just caring about sexism, is now taken on by this one set of theories that isn't really rooted in reality and isn't very ethical.
Right. And so the larger problem that is trying to solve is what? Inequalities between groups in society. Some people have more money than others. Some people have more political power than others, and so on. Is that the
Well,
problem
it
as
doesn't
they
really
see it?
focus very much on money, as the social justice industry is a $9 billion a year training industry, funded by large corporations. So any claims it has to be at all socialist or focusing on economics is really not well supported. And we have the key trainers like Robin DiAngelo and Ibram X. Kendi charging thousands of dollars an hour to, and sometimes like $25,000, $75,000 an hour to train, so that employers can train workers how to think. And this is a significant problem that really needs to be pushed back. So, but mostly it's been focusing on race and on gender, and to a certain extent on the decolonize movement and some ableism in there. So underneath it all is the belief that knowledge is a construct of power. The powerful people in society have decided what is true, and they've done so in their own interests. And these are typically straight, white, Western men. So now they have legitimized certain knowledges, which can include science, reason, liberalism, meritocracy, all of these other ideas that we understand as liberal in that sense of underlying liberal democracy, the Declaration of Independence, the First Amendment. I always say this to Americans because you have two meanings of liberal, and I wish you didn't. So it undermines all of that, and then with this knowledge that has been constructed by the powerful, we all just accept it as true. Apparently, we're all brainwashed, and then we speak in certain ways, and they perpetuate the power imbalances. At the moment, you will be automatically thinking that I cannot be very knowledgeable at all, and you must be much cleverer than me because you're a man and I'm a woman. So you need to dismantle that toxic masculinity that you must necessarily have, and or dismantle your white supremacy or your cis normativity in order to, with these critical methodologies, so that you can then dismantle them. So the trainings are very much about affirm that you hold racist, sexist, homophobic beliefs, then commit to dismantling them.
Did you say you said $9 billion a year industry? Do you mean in the United States and Europe and UK and so on? Everywhere?
This was just in the United States, sort of a look into it by Helen Lewis in her article Woke Capitalism, and it's probably 18 months out of date now. Now there are some signs that there has been a lower uptake of these kinds of programs since 2023, so we can hope that it's gone down, but there are also a lot of pledges, so I wouldn't be too confident.
Yeah. So, for example, at Chapman University, where I was a professor for 12 years, every year all of us had to take that online training program, everybody. So presumably, I don't know how this works, presumably this is an outside company that the university contracts with, and then they charge the university to process every one of those tests, that training programs that people take. And I also noticed you can't game the system anymore. They have like a timer on it, and you have to move your cursor every once in a while, or they know you're not paying attention. So, I mean, they've really got this pretty professionally done. So that's where the bread and butter is. And then, so if every one of the 5,000 plus colleges and universities hire these companies, and however many tens of thousands of companies and corporations hire them, that's where that money comes from.
Yeah, I've been looking mostly at employment. Universities are a bit different. I have had some involvement with those as well. So I think about 15% of counterweight clients were in a university setting. Mostly the problem in university comes from administration. There are, of course, outside trainers, but they're mostly the ones I'm sort of talking about here are mostly going in corporations. Within universities, much more of a problem is the mandatory DEI statement, and the particular policies, the bias investigation teams, and where you can report if you feel you've experienced a microaggression, and particularly with the statements where they're looking for things like saying, I think it was California, Berkeley, which said if anybody who has a DEI statement which says they treat everyone the same regardless of, they're to have the lowest possible score, because that is a colourblind system. It's assuming a meritocracy, an even playing ground, which doesn't exist. So in the universities, it's far more entrenched, and it's far more internal, coming from the administration. Whereas in employment, I think have got a much better chance, private companies, of stepping away from it. And we can see some signs in the US and the UK that they are stepping away from it. They're making fewer pledges, while not in Canada, unfortunately, or in Northern Europe, but in the US and the UK. But in universities, so much of this now is built into the bureaucracy that unpicking and unraveling that is not going to be a simple matter of changing
Yeah.
minds, changing culture, and things
I
will
can
slot
understand why
back
you.
into place. It's
Oh,
going to
sorry.
take a lot more unpicking.
Yeah. I can understand why colleges and universities do it because they're pretty woke. I mean, they're very liberal. So I could see them as being true believers. Corporations, I tend to think a little more cynically that they're just doing it because they feel they have to do it as part of their image or whatever. Or are there true believers in corporate world as well?
Yeah, so on that level, there's very often the box tickers, and these are managers or HR departments who don't really know what they're endorsing, and they just want everybody to go and do these programs, and it's based on Robin DiAngelo and Ibram X Kendi, and there are certain things that have to be affirmed and certain positionality that has to be engaged. I have this knowledge and beliefs because I have these identities, and so that we've got this going on, and quite a lot of the employers don't know. So that is a very useful thing, because what the counterweight method does is get people to explain in a very patient way, this is what these people say, this is what you are asking us to do, and then this can affect a stepping away from it. You can then also worry some employers if you point out that the beliefs that you're being asked to affirm go against belief that people are entitled to hold. So there certainly is a much more of a box ticking image protecting thing going on within within businesses, but there is also a true believer issue, particularly when, as so many of us have been saying, people coming out of the most prestigious universities for the last 10 years now really have been trained in this one particular way of understanding social justice. I call it critical social justice, most people call it woke. And they really have great difficulty in telling the difference between their ideology and just being a good person. So we now have people in workplaces who can be anywhere in their 20s, who really don't have any other ideas. They have not been exposed to other ideas. And so trying to get through to them, this is one belief system that you are entitled to hold. It's squashing out all these other protected belief systems and ethical frameworks. And you need to not do that. And trying to actually get them to see that they're doing that. And of course, there are those who know full well that they're doing that, and they have a political mission to do that. And if you end up in one of those environments, what I call the problematizer, then you really have very little hope of effecting any change.
Yeah. On the cynical end of things, I find these training programs to be the dumbest things I've ever seen. So I asked the president, who's a friend of mine at Chapman, why are we taking these tests? They're so lame. Like, if you overhear a couple people telling an off-color joke, you should A, repeat the joke, B, explain why it's wrong to tell the joke, or C, report it to HR. And of course, the correct answer is always report it to HR, right? It's like, come on. And his explanation was, well, on the cynical end of things, if you ever do something, you or one of our employees, proposition a student or something, and then they lawyer up and the university gets accused, we can say, hey, look, Shermer took the test on this date right there. We are absolved. He was trained in this, right? So I can imagine corporations do this too to avoid lawsuits and protect themselves.
And that's something we've been using, because different countries have different protections. That the US across the Anglosphere is the least protected. You only have protections in employment for religious beliefs, whereas the UK protects philosophical beliefs, and New Zealand and Australia political beliefs as well. So there's limited ground there, but this is a particularly useful one, not for you or for me, who are very well known to be atheists, But the underlying principles of unconscious bias, where you have been unavoidably socialized into white supremacist, patriarchal, imperialistic, homophobic, transphobic views, is something that can be pushed back at most easily from a religious perspective, because so many Americans are Christian, and at the center of Christianity is God-given free will. So in this case, if anybody who comes to us is a believing Christian, then we can say this is your strongest point here. You can say, I am on board with opposing racism, but I cannot, according to my religious conscience, say that I am unavoidably socialized into these beliefs, because it is my belief that God gave me the free will to evaluate sinful ideas and reject them. And racism is a sinful idea. So you would be compelling me to not be a Christian, and that is something that also makes employers very wary. And of course, you do have the First Amendment as well. And while that doesn't apply to employment, if you can show that there's a sort of thorough disregard for freedom of belief and speech, it does make employers think again.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I love that part about your book. It's very practical, right? So let's just go through some of these. So somebody says, "Well, what are your pronouns?" Or they ask you, please put your pronouns in your email signature line or whatever. What do I say if I don't want to do that?
Mm-hmm. Okay, so first of all, you obviously have to evaluate your position and your security here, because if you're very likely to get fired, then what we often say to people, particularly in the teaching, therapeutic, social work professions, is that sometimes it can be better to live, to live to fight another day. And so there are then a stealthy approach where you can say, you can kind of give people what they want without actually compromising your principles. This is much more tricky. But if you're going to make a firm, a polite resistance to that, then you can say, I'm afraid this is not an inclusive ask here. I am fully on board with being inclusive of a variety of different people, but by asking people to put their pronouns or to identify with pronouns, you are asking them to uphold a particular belief in how sex and gender work. Now, it may not seem like it is, but if you can imagine someone putting adult human female in their bio, we know that that's a gender critical position. This is also his is also a political position, and it cannot be upheld by people who don't believe they have a gender identity, who have a conscientious objection to the idea of gender identity, who are feminists, or who are religious believers. So in the interest of being inclusive, I do not think we should put our pronouns in our in our emails any more than we should put the political party that we're going to vote for, our religion, or any other private information which we should be able to keep to ourselves. And that's
Nice. So you're using their own beliefs to turn around on them. I am inclusive, and what you're asking me to do is not inclusive.
yes.
Yeah, I like
This is
that.
diversity and inclusion. When I help employers to write policies, we call it a genuinely inclusive of diverse people, ideas, views, because diversity and inclusion in their original sense are absolutely things that we want to support. But in the critical social justice idea, inclusion means excluding certain ideas which are theorized to make certain groups feel unsafe, and that includes a lot of liberal views that in this sense of the freedom of speech and belief, and meritocracy. It includes gender critical beliefs, it includes conservative beliefs. So this is not at all inclusive. And the same with diversity. When diversity is just about a lot of people with different identities who all believe the same thing, then diversity training can often look a lot more like conformity training. So just in conversation, I get people to use those words in their original sense, so that the HR manager, the university administration, whoever it is, has to actually say, no, I don't mean diverse ideas. I mean black, gay, and trans people. So things. So that works much better in employment, whereas in universities it's much more accepted to actually say We are going on identity. It's all theorized as such within the administration. People feel more confident to say that. Employers are much more likely to think of the bottom line, of wider society, of freedom of belief and speech. So pushing them back onto that ground where they have to say, no, you cannot oppose racism from your own moral values, you have to oppose it from this one, is something they're much more likely to try and avoid doing.
Yeah, I remember some time ago, maybe a year or so, the astrophysicist Sabine Hassenfelder posted on Twitter she's applying for a grant to study black holes. I don't know, the origins of the universe or some such thing. And the grant asked for her DEI statement about how this is going to help whatever people of color or whatever is like. So she posted on Twitter, "What's the right answer here? I have no idea what I'm supposed to plug into this box." You know, and it could be anything. You know, you're applying for a job, or you want to applying for a graduate school or medical school, and they're all asking for these statements. I mean, you can't very well just say, I don't know, what can you say? Like, I'm not on board with this, or what's the right thing to say there?
Depending on how you're going to go about things. So I have got a template in the book for a stealthy way to kind of say what it is wanted, but it's much more open than it looks. And so you can say things like, I am very supportive of underrepresented voices. If I see somebody in my classroom who is of an underrepresented group who appears to be having difficulty in speaking, I make sure the dominant groups give them space. Now, of course, that will often be received within the theories as the straight white men who are doing all the talking. But obviously, in a classroom, there's a diversity of ideas here, and quite often the voices, the people who feel unsafe speaking in a university classroom can be conservatives. They are an underrepresented group. So if you're putting out those kind of statements, which can be read much more broadly, then you're not going against your own values, but you're also speaking the language, and that's very tricky. Particularly, you just mentioned a physicist. We had great difficulty. Physicists, engineers, technology, in particular, they tend to think in this way. This isn't part of their job, and we had so many of them getting themselves in trouble. Did you just find that part of the book?
Yeah, just the appendix here where you suggest actual wording, how to write a letter.
Yes.
Like a letter by a non-white writer objecting to critical social justice approaches to anti-racism. So, dear name of employer, I'm very glad that you are addressing issues of race and racism seriously and developing policies and training programs to address them. I realize that your intention is to benefit people like me who have historically been disadvantaged and are still more likely to face racist discrimination. However, I have some concerns about the way you're going about this. So there's your shift there, but that opening statement. I think you use that actually for a bunch of the letters. I'm pleased that we're addressing this particular issue, whatever it is. Yeah. So in a way, you're saying, I agree with you. This is a problem we should all address, and I'm on board with that. So you kind of win over some respect from them, and then you do the however. For example, the recent communications policy changes and training initiatives intended to benefit people of color and ensure diversity and inclusion have focused on one specific ideological approach to anti-racism. This is an American-centric approach that centers on the work of theorists like Ibram X. Kendi and Robin DiAngelo. I'm afraid such a narrow focus neglects the intellectual and ideological diversity of people of color and the work of many other Black intellectuals and intellectuals of color. So, yeah, I mean, that's a person of color writing that. If it was a white person, you'd recommend something slightly different, I presume.
Yeah, there are variations on that. That letter that you were reading was one that had been written by and with lots of different Black, South Asian, sort of racial minority groups. That my colleague Harry brought together the common concerns from all of them into clusters, and that's one format letter. So anybody who wants to push back at it as a member of a racial minority group can go through that and take inspiration from that. There are also letters you'll often see when it comes to anti-racist training. If white, then in a school, for example, then you can say, I must ask you to stop teaching my child that they hold racist beliefs, which we have taught them not to have at home. I do not want my child to start to take on these beliefs. If you are black, then you can say, I would like you not to teach my child that everybody else holds these beliefs and that everything is stacked against them, because this goes against what we have been teaching them at home, and from different perspectives based on the letters that we did write with clients.
Yeah, these are so good. Here's some of the different ones. Letter objecting to mandatory gender pronoun declaration. Letter objecting to ideologically biased readings on race. Letter objecting to support for radical political movements and public organizations. Letter objecting to affinity groups or other racial segregation. Letter objecting to claims that all white people are racist and or socialized into white supremacy. And this goes on and on. It's astonishing how all of this has erupted just in the last, 5 to 10 years.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, is it that we've all discovered how racist and terrible everybody is, or is it really a social contagion kind of movement triggered by some pretty horrible things like the killing of George Floyd and some of these horrible videos that we've all seen? And then we generalize that, there's a problem to be solved. Here's how I think about it. I'm not the chief of police of the Minneapolis police. What am I going to do? Well, I'm the manager at this corporation. I can feel better about myself. Like I'm helping society by putting all my employees through this racial sensitivity training program. Do you get a sense that that's one of the motives?
And I do, but there's in the ideas themselves, and the reason that I think they have been um, they have been welcome in society, that they have appealed to people, is because of that kernel of truth there. So there was between the 60s and 80s, and a very sort of long ongoing fight, the civil rights movement, the liberal feminist movement, the second wave feminism, gay pride, homosexuality got decriminalized, discrimination in pay on the grounds of race or sex, all of these laws that were standing in the way of one group of people, because that's the liberal stance, is to remove barriers. So if there are laws saying if you're a man you get paid this much and if you're a woman you get paid that much, that's a barrier. Remove that. That's not treating one group any differently to another. It's stopping treating one group differently to another. So that this all happened in quite a rush, and so many other things happened at the same time. From over here, the fall of empire happened. Marxism had demonstrably failed. There was a very strong feeling of disillusionment, and then as these systems that really were, I mean, nobody would deny that Jim Crow was a racially oppressive system. So the idea, when this has all been overturned, that what the theorists would say to absolutely steelman them is, we have now changed the laws, but is this going to change minds? Is this going to change attitudes? If people are still racist, then they will find other reasons not to employ you. They will find ways to prioritise the interests of white people. And what we need to do is to get into people's heads, make them realise that they still hold these beliefs. And it's kind of the first step to solving a problem is admitting you have it. So this is what this deconstructive approach did. You first of all, you have to accept that you are racist, that you are sexist, that you are transphobic, fatphobic, ableist. And only when you have accepted that, can you become aware or woke of it in yourself and dismantle it using this methodology. So this has been building since the first wave of postmodern ideas was really just hopeless and deconstructing things. Then in the 90s, we had post-colonial theory was gaining strength, queer theory, critical race theory, intersectional feminism. These were all coming up, and they wanted to reconstruct the things. So they're okay. We've torn everything apart. Now we need to accept systems of power and prejudice exist, and those are what we need to focus on. And then around 2010, that the scholarship has changed again. to a much more solid narrative, a very, very simple one that I gave at the beginning of this, which now runs through everything and as is accepted as objectively true. So this is how the ideas have changed. The reason it's caught on so well, I think, is because we have had post-colonial guilt. There is a genuine guilt among well-intentioned people who why did we not know? Why did we accept things like Jim Crow and colonizing half the planet? Why did we accept this as normal? Why did people? And then if they didn't realize how morally abhorrent this was, what am I not realizing now? So you've got a lot of really well-intentioned want to dig into things, and I think certain theorists have leapt on this, and they've pushed into place a very specific set of theories which don't take into account the fact that people are individuals, that they have varied backgrounds, or their own agency to evaluate ideas, and that's what's been growing massively, and until, of course, we saw the little eruptions on university campuses that affected Nicholas and Erica Christakis, Brett Weinstein, various other people, and then explosions in young adult books and in the knitting circles of all things in little enclosed communities. But it was fairly ripe to explode on a wider scale for some time. And I think the fear of COVID that happened in 2020, people did not know at that point what this was, how deadly it was going to be. Historically, when a plague of some kind has hit, then throughout Europe, we turn on the Jews. People want something to fight. They want a human enemy. And so we've seen a lot of pogroms happening in the time of plague. And I think that in 2020, when George Floyd had his neck knelt on for so many minutes and people were afraid of an unknown thing, I think that this was the ignition point, but it was there. It was under the surface for building for a good 5 years. That was a very long explanation.
No, that was perfect. Yeah. Yeah, I'm trying to get my mind around all that. I had a podcast guest, Trisha Rose. Her book is Meta Racism. So we talked about some of this. Do I have white privilege? I guess so, but I don't. It doesn't feel like that to me. It just feels like I'm not being held back based on any criteria of my skin color or my sex or gender or whatever. I'm just free to do what I want. Everybody should have that. Nobody should be held back based on these kind of criteria. That's the society we want. But her argument to that then is that, well, yeah, but generationally speaking, you've had these benefits going back, to your parents and grandparents and great grandparents and all the way back. And even if you abolish, let's say, the Jim Crow laws or redlining and real estate and so on, there's still this kind of cumulative difference in like who gets a home loan. And okay, so they can't discriminate based on skin color, redlining or whatever, but your credit scores are going to matter to what extent you get a home loan or any kind of loan. And why do I have good credit scores? Well, because my parents taught me, pay off your credit card bill every month and so on. And maybe somebody raised in some other crappy neighborhood by a single mom working 2 jobs and, on and on and on. They just didn't learn all that. So I got this benefit of being, a middle-class white guy, of learning how to game the system or game it, how to play, how the game is played. You got to have credit scores, you got to have a bank account, you got to have a checking account, and so on and so on. And then all that adds up to these benefits that I don't even see, and that, say, people of color don't have those kind of benefits. Anyway.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of truth in there, although there's too broad brushstrokes get come into use with that, where we then tend to see everybody who is white as having had this wonderful privileged background, and everybody who is black as not having had it. I think Glenn Lowry is particularly good on how insulting he finds this assumption. But what you were describing there, I would say is best understood as class. Because what has happened in US history, and to a certain extent in UK history, but much briefer, and I'll stick in the US anyway, it is, of course, this segregation of 2 populations with different opportunities. And we know that the very best indicator of being successful is if your parents have been successful. If you've grown up in a house with educated university graduates with a lot of books, then you are more likely to be successful. If your family has only been, your group has only been allowed to be successful for 2 generations, then we should not be surprised that statistics are not balancing at this point. But what I would say that a useful way to look at this is that class systems have been formed. They've been formed around race, but what they are essentially are class systems where American descendants of enslaved Africans have been forced into a very low socioeconomic class, which is now very difficult to climb out of. But of course, there are white populations as well whose families have been very, very poor and are in a similar situation. And then there are middle class, well educated Black Americans who are not in that situation at all. A lot of affirmative action policies often tends to then benefit the middle class professional, the children of professionals who are going to do well anyway, because it's not looking at that socioeconomic thing.
Yeah, it's a splendid example of counterfactual reasoning. What about this group over here? What about that group over there? Certainly, Appalachian white poor people are not going to feel like they have white privilege. I mean, I've heard him say this, right? It's kind of that J.D. Vance and the, Tara Westover's educated and all these, people is like, where's my privilege? And that's why they end up voting for Trump or whatever. So, yeah, I get that. Okay, so now in terms of strategies, yours is, kind of a bottom-up, voluntary, we're fighting the battle of ideas. When you encounter this idea, you counter it with this, you counterweight it with this other idea. Here's what you literally say. Now, someone like Chris Rufo says that's not enough. We need legislation. We need to go at it from the top down, change the laws, ban DEI. As you know, this is what he's been doing. He just got Texas to do this in Florida. And I think there's a couple other states doing it now. Just outlaw it. It's a violation of the Civil Rights Act, 1964, and so on. And it's discriminatory, and we're going to put an end to it. How do you think about these two different kind of strategies?
Okay, there are two things there. So where I would agree with Mr. Rufo is when he says that it isn't enough to just have this groundswell of normal everyday people understanding these and changing their own workplace environments. And it isn't. Most of the other organisations that formed at the same time were coming top down. They were trying to change things on a legal level, on an institutional level, on a grand scale. And counterweight as the creating the groundswell, trying to get people everywhere, whoever they were, pushing up and pushing back on an individual level, making local changes. These are compatible. There is not a need for anybody to see these as in competition. When somebody who came to counterweight had an issue that could make an important legal case, then we referred them to one of the organisations who were trying to make groundbreaking legal cases. If they had somebody who had an individual problem, they referred them to us. So this top-down, bottom-up approach is a good one. But where I disagree with some of Christopher Rufo's approaches is that often the way he speaks, he seems to want to ban certain sets of ideas. Now, I think there does have to be legal changes in places like in universities, in public institutions, but there's a very short-sighted argument going around here now saying we need to ban specifically critical race theory, specifically these ideas, put them into law and ban those so that it's perfectly liberal to do that because they're illiberal ideas. Okay, but this is a very narrow and specific approach. Once you have given the government power to ban ideas that they find subversive, bad for society, what are you opening up here? So I have said, I've argued with Rufo online, in fact, that you can take two approaches here. If you go to a university and you say, right, you have a responsibility not to enable ideological bias. You need to show that you are not suppressing any ideas. If, say, all of your political scientists are left-wing, you need to show that you have done something to try to recruit conservatives, libertarians. And if you haven't been able to recruit any, what are you doing to make sure that your students are getting the best possible introduction to those ideas as well as your own? So this kind of reform that says you must not impose any ideas on anyone, that gets critical social justice. That scuppers that nicely, because if they can't impose on anybody else, if they have to compare their ideas, if they have to be open to critique, essentially act like scholars, then that is the power gone. Whereas if you say these particular ideas are bad and we need to ban them, you're not only opening that up for a new government, a new system, which will say, well, now we have a precedent for this, so let's get rid of these different ideas, but you're also making things much more confusing, as we saw across schools when there was cynical theories got put on the naughty list in Texas because it teaches about critical race theory. And in Florida, the books that were taken out of libraries because schools got so anxious about what content they were and weren't allowed to include, it removed encyclopedias, dictionaries, the Diary of Anne Frank, Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, Ripley's Believe It or Not. Where this is, it's just too subjective and too local to try and ban certain ideas.
Yeah, for sure. Not a precedent you want to set for the government that has the power that it has, for sure.
Mm.
Yeah, I like the bottom up approach for the most part. Yeah, I mean, they can work together if necessary. But so we've been focusing mostly on racial diversity, which you're promoting as viewpoint diversity, which I agree with. If you can't hire conservative and libertarian professors, at least expose the students by bringing in outside speakers, right? No more banning, canceling, deplatforming, and so on. I know we're in agreement on there. What about gender, sex and gender? That's kind of erupted in the last 5 years. Also, what do you make of that, and how are you dealing with that?
Yeah, well, that has been a particularly big fight on my island, as you may well know, which has been dubbed
Yep.
Turf Island, because we've had a particularly strong gender critical feminist pushback, and with quite a lot of support, and we are now seeing some very good results of laws changing, which are not allowing um, male sex offenders into prisons with women who are that are starting to make sure that sporting categories are single sex. So we're seeing, and the Tavistock children's gender clinic has been closed because it had such awful results, and I expect you've seen the CAS report. So we're seeing
Mm-hmm.
some changes there, but this has the when all of these intersectional ideas of race, gender, in immigration status, sexuality, weight, disability, that they were all trying to do business all at once, it became very clear that two of them were emerging at the top, and that was race and gender identity. And it was quite clear that these were going to, at some point, conflict, particularly in the US, because they don't necessarily go that well together. So when we saw the Black Lives Matter movement saying that they wanted to dismantle the nuclear family, and that the sort of support for the queer and women of color, a lot of this language was coming out of that movement. A lot of African Americans, in particular, who have a higher degree of religiosity, are more likely to be Christian. Well, what does this have to do with Black lives? And we saw this last year on Juneteenth, when one organisation said Juneteenth is about queer people, and a whole load of Black Americans came back and said, "You've got a whole month. Can we have one day?" And there was there's a conflict there because they don't necessarily go well together. But the gender identity has been snaking its way up and becoming more and more of an issue, with particularly strong focus on word games. trying to confuse concepts of biological sex. And that's worked in quite a different way, and it's really a battle going on the grounds of language.
Yeah, that's certainly important. If you say men can get pregnant, I tweeted this the other day. Sure, they can. If by man you mean woman,
Mm.
if you're just redefining the terms, then what are we even talking about when we're using language? And that seems to be where the turf war is now, on using certain words, all the way down to the pronoun stuff we talked about already. I think of old school liberals like yourself and J.K. Rowling, just speaking of your turf island there. Um, what happened between, why are these people, the woke progressives, whatever term we want to use, why are they not supporting traditional liberal values? They seem to have become illiberal. What happened in there?
I mean, this particular branch of thinking isn't from the liberal tradition. So we can know that true believers are are a small percentage of society, and that the hidden tribes, I think it was 8 or 12%. I can't quite remember now, who were described as progressive activists. And when I took that test, I was a progressive activist, and I'm a centre left liberal. I'm certainly not woke. So there really is a very small number of people, but they have come as a reaction to liberalism. So you can see particularly in critical race theory, one of its central tenets is critique of liberalism. And their argument is that the civil rights movement, civil rights discourse, equality under the law, colourblindness, meritocracy are all just preserving the status quo, and they're not making any further progress. So they reject liberalism as a way forwards. Kimberly Crenshaw, she describes intersectionality as postmodern theory connected to contemporary politics, and what she means by that is I think, from whatever else she says, is the radical black tradition mixed with postmodernism. And in that, she says we have to reject the complete deconstruction approach of postmodernism, and we have to reject liberalism, and we have to go with identity politics and apply postmodern ideas to it. And it's this intersectional idea in which belief in the individual, we should all be treated as an individual, regardless of any other identity, and have the same opportunities. This idea of pluralism, we are all come from different backgrounds, we have different ideas. These need to do productive and civil battle with each other, and also just coexist without stepping on each other. And the universalism of liberalism, which is that we all have a shared humanity, we all have the same rights, responsibilities, and freedoms. This is something that just got really squashed down, because in the first place, when these ideas arose, they were coming from the original postmodernists were disillusioned Marxists, because Marxism had failed so badly, and there was this sense of the the deconstruction of meta narratives, and this was really tied into, okay, the main left wing framework for revolutionizing society is not working. And from this has come this very sort of postmodern approach to analyzing culture through invisible power systems. So that's kind of cropped up in as a direct reaction against liberalism. So that the liberals, and I will take responsibility here, and I would say there are liberals on the right and liberals on the left. Of course, that's anybody who can say, I believe that all people are created equal with the unalienable right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Great, you're a liberal. So those people, we did not spot the authoritarianism of critical social justice as quickly as we should have done, because it had that kernel of truth, because it had we've fixed things on a legal level. Now we need to address social attitudes. Well, yes, we do, but not like that. The way trying to get people to see these theories and how they work has been a real problem, and that's what the Grievance Studies project was about, trying to get liberal lefties to see what these ideas were. It's what cynical theories was about.
Yeah. Oh man, you're so good, Helen. You put this so well. Yeah, I call that classical liberalism, I think, instead of liberalism, because the words are constantly shifting and we have to redefine them. Yeah. So on the nuclear family thing, why dismantle the nuclear family? What? Because it's a Western value and it's bundled with all the other stuff, colonialism and capitalism and all the other evils. I mean, my libertarian tendencies, you want to get married and have kids, go for it. You want to stay single, go for it. I don't care. It doesn't affect me. Is it that because governments have been involved in the marriage business, for example, I get a tax break by being married. I get a tax break for having a kid. I get a tax break for owning a home, right? So is it that the government is involved in it and it's become a collective action problem? We've decided as a nation we're better off if people are married, so we're going to give benefits, and then people who are not married or don't buy into the nuclear family tradition, they feel left out? Or is it more ideological because of this kind of Western bundle of characteristics?
I think it's, you do sometimes get these sort of socioeconomic arguments that certain groups are being economically privileged because they are fitting in with the establishment. But more often it's this idea of normativity. And within the sort of queer theory branch, which is now sort of linked with intersectionality with the critical theories of race, this idea of normativity is that if we observe that the majority of people are heterosexual, then we are making a normative statement. And if you can compare the difference between a common and normal and the opposites of that, this is what queer theory is kind of twisting. If I say it is more common to be heterosexual, this has a very different tone to it's normal to be heterosexual, and a very different tone to it's abnormal to be homosexual. But the queer theorists have taken these categories and they see them as oppressive in themselves. So if you are not fitting into the category of masculine man attracted to women or feminine woman attracted to men, rather than the liberal approach, which has been, some people are gay, get over it. You know, we protect the outliers. We don't expect everybody to conform to what is most common. That just isn't part of the liberal individualist tradition. But within the queer theory deconstruction tradition, we need to break things down. These systems, the system of marriage, the system of heterosexuality is as much an institution that's causing systemic oppression as literal institutions that were, actually had rules within them to disadvantage certain groups of people.
Yeah, okay, that makes sense. That normativity argument. Would that apply then to this whole sex and gender issue? That is to say, let's leave out for a moment the rapid onset gender dysphoria, which has huge numbers, and just go with the old school one, which was gender dysphoria. Some tiny fraction of 1% of people feel like they're born in the wrong body. They're uncomfortable from an early age. They transition when they're adults, and their life is better because of that. Is it okay? That's fine. Good. And I just published somebody on my Skeptic column this week who did all that. Is it that you want to then say that's not abnormal? It's not a statistical outlier. It's normal, and it's a spectrum. You can be anything you want, and there is no normal. It's just whatever anybody wants, and it's a whole spectrum, and therefore we can't place any kind of moral judgment on anybody on the spectrum.
Yeah,
Something like that.
it's breaking down those categories. It's going right back, and I describe the queerists as appearing a lot like alien sociologists who have just arrived on the planet, never encountered a sexually reproducing species anymore before, and they're trying to work out what it all means. And so they're asking questions like, why are most people heterosexual? Why do most people identify as men if they have a penis, and as women if they have a vagina? And of course, the answer is because we are a sexually reproducing species, bimodal, dimorphic. But this is, queer theory in particular, wants to break down a science which it sees as oppressive, and particularly the science of sexuality. And some of the early the sexologists of the late 19th century, they did assume that homosexuality was a disorder. And this is where the queer theorists start from. They say this was the liberal scientific position. Homosexuality must be a disorder because it was different. It wasn't the same. So we need to break down these assumptions of what is normal and what should be, and we need to say, how do we, what is gender, what is sex, why do we even say that there are men and women, why have we broken things into this binary? And they see a liberation in doing that. So yeah, that what you're describing before, the old school transsexuals, people who are experiencing, for whatever reason, discomfort in their own body after having a transition and medication, hormones, they do feel better. Then yeah, this is a small number of people for whom this was the right choice. No, the transsexuals, different to transgender, were very clear that this was a matter of sex, that they did not feel their sex fitted them. They tend to still know that they are biological males who have had treatment to more closely resemble the female form, which feels more right to them. And society can generally say, oh, okay, unless you have very socially conservative or religious views, liberals or the libertarians, as you would say, can say, okay, you are an adult, you have made this decision for yourself. There is no reason for anyone to be unkind to you. In this new queer theory approach, it is very, very different. We're trying to break down the whole structures of male, female, feminine, masculine, heterosexual, homosexual.
Right. And that's part of that whole Western tradition of all these different features that they want to break down. Have you had any clients or people come to you that were fired from their jobs or
Unfortunately,
kicked out of graduate school or whatever? Yeah.
yeah.
And how do you advise them? What should they do?
Well, by the time they've been fired, there isn't much we can do. If they're obviously, then some of their cases, if they're of public interest enough, then we got people in touch with newspapers. If they're in the universities, then we would speak to fire. If they had a good case, then we would speak to lawyers. But generally, people come to us before they get fired, and we try to help them not to get fired. And we do, I mean, have a surprisingly high success rate, but we do lose some. We do. I mean, sometimes one case, it was we coached this guy for ages. He really did not want to do his this anti-racist training, which really was the worst of the worst. It included, if I remember correctly, that having to make the affirmation, all white people are racist and I am not an exception. So it really, the full on thing. And so we talked to him. We helped him write down. I will stand my ground in this. I will say I oppose this racism. I do not hold these views, but I am with you on opposing racism. But he got into it, and then the trainer asked him, "Why are you here?" And he said, "Because I don't want to get fired." And he was fired. So yeah, sometimes yes, but what we said about the diplomacy, that was not it. But yes, people that,
Yeah.
and we lost a
I,
fireman as
yeah.
well, and that was a particularly sad one. So yeah,
Firemen.
yes, we ended up with quite a few firemen because they speak to each other and they tend to be action orientated people as well.
I
So
would hope so.
yeah. So they got themselves into trouble, a couple of them, and with questioning really quite silly ideas. In one case, a DEI thing had gone around in which it was saying that people needed to be aware of their white privilege, their cis privilege, in particular when going to incidents, so that firefighters needed to be aware how they could respond differently if somebody was black or if somebody was transgender. And yeah, one of our firemen was quite annoyed about this and saying, well, I'm very practical, orientated mind, saying, I'm not going to stop in an incident and work out what race or gender identity somebody has. I'm going to get them out of there. And this, of course, is seen as denial. And another one,
Unbelievable.
again, with and this was the one we lost. It was very action orientated. Again, one of a group had said that it was dangerous to be black in this town, and that there was systematic racism in the organisation. And he wrote to them saying, "Please, can you give me evidence of these claims and examples of what you mean? Because if this is happening, then I want to get involved in helping." And they didn't respond to that. So he did some freedom of information requests to find out if there was any discrimination, if there was a history of violence, or and he couldn't find anything. And he wrote to them again, and then they accused him of harassing them, and said that his very questions showed that he would respond differently in an incident to black people than to white people. And then everything went extremely badly from there, because he was very indignant about this, as you would be if you are, if you've dedicated 20 years of your life to rescuing people, and then somebody just casually suggests that you might let someone die if they happen to be black. It's going to upset somebody with a strong sense of purpose in their job. And so he, unfortunately, rather than shout and swear at people in this meeting, he left the meeting, and on his way out, he headbutted a locker. And that was how they got him.
Oh,
They said he'd left the disciplinary meeting and he'd damaged property, but really they wanted him out because they wanted to appease this group.
yeah. That's too bad, because this is my argument against deep root causism, when really you should be focused on specific problems. Like it's that cop right there. He's a racist. He treats black suspects differently than he treats white suspects. We have evidence of this. We have body cameras. We have reports from other police. We have reports from suspects and so on. We're going to get rid of that guy. As opposed to, let's defund the police, or all police are racist, or, or something like that, which not only does it not solve the problem, it does exactly what you just described. It makes people who are actually not racist resentful, and just to say, well, then the hell with it.
Exactly. I mean, the people who are going to be most stung by the injustice and really feel it most strongly if they're accused of holding racist views are people who oppose racism. People who uphold racism, who think it's absolutely fine to feel that way, who are openly racist, really don't care about being called racist. So of course there's a lot of people between those two. But
yeah,
yes.
real hardcore racists are not going to be influenced by these training programs. They're just going to laugh at them.
And this
really
is what it found. Exactly what you would expect it to find is that that people who did hold racist ideas already in these studies into DEI training find that you're more likely to know what biases someone has by asking them than by putting them through an unconscious bias, implicit association test. People tend to know what their biases are. If they have racist biases that they perhaps feel a bit ashamed of, and they then enter a training session where they're told, well, you're white, everybody does, how are they going to respond to that? What some of the studies have shown is that they feel validated. There's nothing like being told everyone does it, it's normal, to actually stop trying to weed out those and those prejudices that you have. It's so profoundly counterproductive. Nothing, I think, has been worse for the cause of opposing racism than getting rid of the idea that racist is something you can choose to be or choose not to be, and that if you choose to hold racist ideas, that is morally wrong.
Helen, I haven't talked to you since October 7th. What do you make of the spike in anti-Semitism around the Western world? Well, everywhere, really. Is it just that it was always there and buried and it's now coming out? Or is it some of it at least just a temporary thing? Like, we're in favor of the oppressed group, and because the Jews are more powerful than the Arabs in the Middle East, therefore I have to be against Israel, and Israel is populated by Jews, therefore I'm against Jews. I know. What do you make of all this that we've seen?
Yeah, I mean this goes into two different sets of theories. That the rise of anti-Semitism even before October the 7th. So there's this concept of cultural racism, where if one cultural group is being more successful than another, it's because they are unfairly privileged. Jews, of course, are statistically a very successful group. Also, Ashkenazi Jews across the Western world are predominantly white. So they have been kind of theorized in critical social justice circles as the whitest of white people, the top of white privilege. And this then, of course, does the whole horseshoe thing with the Jews are controlling the world narrative coming from the far right. And then with the Israel and Hamas situation, then you have post-colonial theorists who are going to read other countries, other disputes through their own lens. They are only going to see Israel as a load of white people oppressing a load of brown people. And of course, there is a history there, and I think legitimate arguments can be made about the Balfour Agreement and having unsettled the Middle East and how this can ethically work out and people can come down on either side without being anti-Muslim or anti-Semitic. But we are seeing a really simplistic narrative now with all Jews are white, all Israelis are apparently white and Jewish, even though Israel is actually particularly diverse, much more than the UK. So I'm always surprised to hear this. And all Palestinians are apparently brown, except in Palestine, the groups divide between white and black, is how they refer to each other. And it doesn't quite fit with this system. But yeah, Jews are seen then as, and they will say Zionists are seen as the settler colonialist oppressors. And then it's read through an American centric um, decolonial narrative, and it's a mess.
Yeah. Well, right. I had this podcast guest, Enot Wilf, who was on the Israeli parliament for a while, and she served in the IDF. She was part of their intelligence agency. And her argument was that there's no two-state solution because Palestinians, they don't want two states. They want one state. No Israel. No Jews. From the river to the sea, Palestine will be free means no Israel. So, and she says they've been saying this for a long time, just no one in the West wants to listen. It's like they can't really mean that. Yeah, that's what they really mean. Anyway, that's her take on it. It just seems like, you do have a variety of people that are, responding in different ways. I want to give a little slack to some of these college students that are just shouting these things and they don't even know what they mean. What's the river? I don't know. I picture them in the dorm room, just studying, and somebody says, "Hey, there's a big march. We're going to go support Palestine." Yeah, okay. And they go down there and they wear their little garb and they shout things. And, I don't think of them as like deeply anti-Semitic. They've always hated Jews. There's probably a spectrum there of different kind of bigotries from light to deeper.
I mean, I can tell you that I looked quite deeply into the statistics of anti-Semitic views in the UK, and what I found very interesting is anti-Semitic views are highest among far right culturally Christians, but it's about 15% of them hold anti-Semitic views, and I think it was 17% of Muslims hold anti-Semitic views. Then down at the lowest anti-Semitic views are on the centre left, and then it only rises up a tiny bit for the far left. But when you ask about opinions on Israel, the far left is way up here. So people will argue that theoretically there isn't anti-Semitism on the left, there is anti-Zionism. But I would ask them to put this in the concept of white people and whiteness. So they will also argue that when they're critiquing whiteness, this is an ideology of white superiority, which is held by white people and perpetuates white supremacy. So they will say we are criticizing the system of whiteness, not people who have white skin. But then in practice, criticizing whiteness looks a lot like criticizing people with white skin, and it does come out as a wholesale demolishment of somebody's character because they are white. And this is what I would argue is happening with Zionism and anti-Semitism as well. People who say we are not anti-Semitic, there isn't anything about being Jewish that we have a problem with, but we are anti this system of being pro-Israel, and this is associated with Jews, and so Jews are kind of all complicit in it. And then this comes out as a prejudice, a political prejudice against Jews who are all assumed to be complicit in the same way that white people are assumed to be complicit in white supremacy. Do you see what I mean? It's kind of gone around a corner.
Yeah, oh yeah, I see. Yeah, yeah, that makes sense. But this idea there should not be a Jewish state or Israel should not exist. Why? Because they're colonialists. They stole the land. They did, they indiscriminately kill civilians in their conflicts and so on. Well, I mean, look at the history of the United States. We stole all this land from the Native Americans. We enslaved Africans and brought them here against their will. We've dropped 2 atomic bombs on civilians in Japanese cities. We mass carpet bombed Hamburg and Dresden in World War II. That didn't particularly have military strategic reasons for, and on and on. But no one's calling for, the end of the American state. Get rid of the United States, give it back to the Native Americans. Nothing like that. Why is it that Israel has to disappear?
I think because it does tie in that this is seen as a recent development. There are ongoing conflicts. People do feel as though they have to take a side. Now, as you said before, it is this cluster of beliefs. Of course, because there's a wonderful Mike Nainer put up this wonderful slogan which said, "Palestine is about Black Lives Matter, queer lives matter." All of these different, the whole intersectional thing. It's about supporting trans people. It's about supporting Black people. It's about supporting gay people. It's about supporting women. What? That you've just put this into a cluster, and as you say, yeah, I think it is very much like that there will be a young person there who's okay. Palestine is one of the things that you support if you are intersectional, if you've got these critical social justice ideas, and many people don't know why they support it. It's just that cluster. And of course, we see that in the anti-woke space as well, because I have been very critical of critical social justice. I will inexplicably get people assuming that I am pro Brexit, that I am critical, I'm skeptical of vaccines, and I'm skeptical of climate change, because these are the 4 things that are put together. And so I will sometimes even get a message from a radio station saying, "Can you come and talk about the problem with vaccines?" No, I can't. I'm not an epidemiologist studying uh, critical social justice theories for 15 years. You're doing this cluster, and I would really love for us to normalise saying, "I don't know enough about this to have a respect-worthy opinion," rather than thinking, because my tribe has these 4 positions, I must have them all as well.
Yeah, yeah, that's right. Well, it's a very common human thing to do of classifying people by these different clustered characteristics. You've been generous with your time, Helen. I wanted to ask you what I asked Pete. I was on Pete's podcast recently. He says, "Do you have any questions for me?" And I said, "Yeah. What do you think the effects were of the grievance papers now, 5 years later, however long it's been? I mean, are you glad you did it? Did it have an effect? Would you do it again? That kind of thing." So I'll ask you, you were part of that whole thing. What do you think the effects were? Was it worth doing? Would you do it
I
again?
think it was. I think the benefits of it now are really as a resource. So at the time, our motivations were really two things. I wanted to show that we did actually know what we were talking about. So often people, I did anyway, people would say to me, "Oh, you just don't understand intersectionality." And I really do. So, okay, get 7 papers published. That can't be said anymore. And we really wanted people on the liberal left who just weren't seeing it to see it, to see how bad those papers were. And I think we did make a bit of a splash on it. Some people did see the problem, and then of course it covered over again, and the problem continued to rise. Now, what I'm finding is the most useful thing of that project was a writer wrote to me the other day saying, "Can you explain this thing where it's good to be to make students feel uncomfortable about who they are?" And I can say, yes, that's the pedagogy of discomfort. We wrote the progressive stack paper where we argued that you should make students feel like that. Here is the paper, it explains it all, and there's about 25 sources there. And that is, I think, what is going to be useful going forwards. And that is another thing that we very much did it for. We wanted to collect a lot of different genres of bad ideas into one paper and then kind of summarize them. So now anybody really wanting to understand these ideas, we're likely to have a paper that's covered a cluster of them. So for that reason, I do think it's valuable.
Nice. I agree.
We
Yeah.
are way
I use it in the same way I like the Alan Sokol hoax back in the 90s. I mean, it's a useful tool to see what happens when you take ideas and go too far with them, and particularly with the use of language and not being specific about that. All right, Helen, thank you so much. Here is the Counterweight Handbook. Highly recommended you get this. Where can people find you? Is there a counterweight.org or something like? What's the webpage?
Well, no, there's me, H Pluckrose on Twitter, or you can find me on the Overflowings of a Liberal Brain on Substack, and the Counterweight
Oh, nice.
resources have merged with the Institute of Liberal Values.
Institute of Liberal Values. Okay. We'll put that in the show notes so people can find. I'm just thinking if somebody has a problem with their employer or their graduate advisor or whatever on one of these issues, they could come to you and say, help.
Well, I'm working more with employers now, but the person to come to is me, and I am quite likely to have something that I can send already. So I ask people just to contact me now.
Are you optimistic that the tide is turning and maybe say in the next 5 to 10 years this will be part of our history?
Yes, I think the statistics are looking good, that people are getting sick of woke. It is losing its cultural prestige and power. So I think that in that sense, peak woke has passed. I think we're going to see it's going to take some time to go out. It's still very much present in certain universities. It's very much present in certain workplaces. And we're also going to have that awful thing of the death throes, where a movement can get particularly extreme when it's under threat. So I certainly wouldn't be complacent. And there is also, of course, the risk that if the right, and what is now often being called the woke right, gets too authoritarian, gets too much power itself, then this could then it exacerbate sympathy for the woke left. And so my end chapter is about how to see wokeness out in an ethical way without this pendulum constantly swinging back and forth. So that complicated thing is, yes, I'm optimistic, but not complacent. We're not there yet.
Good. Okay. Let's be vigilant.
Yes.
All of us. All right, Helen, thank you so much for your time. I'm such a huge fan of your work. I love it. Keep going. And we'll have you on for the next book. And maybe the tide will be completely turned by then.
Let's hope so.